I recently built a storage box out of walnut for my buddy's Catan game. He 3D printed the custom-made pieces himself, and the pieces are H.P. Lovecraft inspired. Here's what the set looks like during gameplay. The pieces were truly a work of art, and I wanted to make sure that the box could be worthy of holding those pieces inside of it. In addition to holding the custom-made pieces, I also wanted to be able to store the original game pieces inside of it as well. Besides making a plywood prototype for this project, this was technically the first wooden box I've made, and I'm going to show you in this video how I made it. For the main portion of the box, I'm going to be using 4/4 or 1-inch walnut. Now, due to the price of walnut, I wanted to make sure that I used as much of the material as possible and was very, very precise with my measurements and what I was using for this project. Now here was one of my first of many injuries on this project, and what I'm doing is just setting my table saw blade to 45 degrees to cut in the miters, because I'm going to use miter joints for the box. Now this is a good example of why you should have a zero clearance insert plate on your table saw. This kind of scared the crap out of me, and I ordered one the very next day. I could have probably also used a sacrificial fence as well on my miter gauge. Once I was done with all my cuts, I did a dry fit to make sure everything lined up nice and square, or at least close to square. I numbered each panel in order to have a continuous grain wrap around the box, and I also labeled where the bottom was because I was going to route a groove where a 1/4 inch panel would go for the bottom of the box. To route the grooves on the bottom of the panels, I'm using a 1/4 inch straight cut bit. I'm also routing the groove about a 1/4 inch from the bottom so that panel is not directly flush on the bottom of the box. This is personal preference, and I thought about making a rabbet instead of a groove and putting the panel right on the bottom, but I decided to go this route, no pun intended, instead, and thought it just looked nicer. Next, I needed to figure out what the bottom panel size would actually be. I thought it was going to be difficult to do this, but essentially, I just took the dimensions of the inside of the box and added the depth of the groove that I cut all around. I'm also using a lighter wood to contrast the dark walnut color of the box for the bottom panel. Once the bottom panel was cut out, I did a dry assembly of the box and the panel to make sure everything fit nice and snug. To make my life easier, I sanded the inside of the box before I glued it together. And I'm using hide glue because it has a longer assembly time, and I think that's really important, especially when you're trying to get your box nice and square and adjust the clamps and things like that. I'm also not gluing in the bottom panel, I'm just letting it float freely inside the groove that I routed out. Before placing the clamps on, I'm using some painter's tape to kind of hold the box together, just so I can adjust it to clean up some glue and get the actual clamps into position and all set while keeping the box relatively square. Now, as I put these clamps on, I'm going to adjust them and check for square consistently and make any kind of fine-tune adjustments as needed. Now, if I cut my miters properly, I won't have to do too much pulling into square, but hey, I'm not perfect and I'm still learning a lot about woodworking, so cut me a break. While waiting for the glue to dry on the box, I decided to start working on the top panel. And I'm using walnut for the top panel to match the rest of the box. I'm actually going to use 2 pieces from this board of walnut and edge joint them together. After milling both boards, it was time to glue them together into one panel. After letting the glue dry, I used a chisel to remove any squeeze out left over from the glue. Then I marked out the final dimensions of the top of the box and cut it out on the table saw. And surprisingly, on the first few cuts, I got it pretty close to perfect. Whatever was remaining, I could sand off. To reinforce the miter joints, I was going to use splines, and here I'm marking where the splines are going to go. In order to cut the splines, I decided to go with a router and use a router sled designed for cutting splines. I purchased this jig online from MLCS Woodworking, and I'll link it in the description below. It was about $100, and all in all, I'll have to say that this worked pretty well for cutting these splines. To contrast with the walnut, I'm using maple for my splines. And I just cut them out on the bandsaw and then glued them in. And once the glue dried, I just used a flush trim saw to cut them down. And I'm using blue tape to protect the walnut so I don't scratch up the surface. And finally, I just sanded what was remaining to match up with the rest of the box. Then I sanded what was to be the inside of the top panel before gluing it up. Now, to glue the top panel to the box, I'm going to use hide glue and then use blue tape as a temporary clamp until I could get all my squeeze clamps and clamps that fit onto the box. Once the glue was dry, I used a chisel to remove any remaining squeeze out and then gently sanded by hand to make sure everything was nice and flush. The next step was cutting the lid. Now, this step made me very nervous, and I took a lot of time preparing for this cut. I will advise to be very, very cautious when doing such a cut on a table saw. I'm using blue tape to A, prevent some tear out, and B, keep the lid space separate in addition to using these shims so the opening doesn't pinch down on the blade and cause a catastrophe. The cut went well for the most part, but there was a little corner that I had to cut with the flush trim saw and then go over with a chisel and some hand tools to get flush with the rest of the top of the box. Once I had the lid cut off, I also cleaned up the glue squeeze out on the inside of the box, and then I decided to route over the two edges on the lid just to make it a little bit more appealing and get rid of some of those sharp edges. Now, I noticed there were some gaps in where the splines were, and I decided to fill those in with some wood filler. The next step was to sand everything to prepare for finish. And once I was done sanding, I wiped everything down with some mineral spirits. To finish the box, I'm using General Finishes Armor Seal, and I have to say this is probably one of the best finishes I've ever used. It's an oil-based finish, so it does take some time in between coats, but it is well worth it. And you may not be able to see, but I do have my garage door open for ventilation. I sanded in between each coat using some high grit sandpaper, and then just wiped everything down with a lint-free cloth before applying another coat of finish. I put 3 coats total on, and when the last coat was dry, I wiped everything down on the box with a brown paper bag, which acts like extremely high grit sandpaper. And I know you can't feel it through the screen, but this box is so smooth and just feels amazing. And that completes the box portion. Now it's on to the trays. For the interior trays, I decided to go with a contrasting wood, and I'm using maple here. This board that I'm cutting up and milling down is a 4/4 board. However, the final thickness of the pieces for the tray was going to be just over a 1/2 inch, so I had some work to do to get these trays right where I needed them to be. Now, I could have resawed the boards, but I wasn't too confident in my ability to do that safely with the tools that I had in my shop. So I decided to plane them down, which took a very long time. After some calculations on how many trays I was going to make and how they would fit in the box, I decided to rip them down to about 2 inches. This way I could stack all the trays inside the box and close the lid nice and tight. Then it was time to cut all the pieces down to their final length, and then take one last trip to the thickness planer to make sure all the pieces were exactly the same thickness. Then I laid out my pieces to see how I was going to do joinery for the trays. But before actually joining them, I pre-sanded everything. For the joinery, I decided to use butt joints and screws to join all the pieces together. However, I was going to countersink the screw holes so I could fill them with dowels. I wanted to do through dowel joinery originally, but every test piece I did, I messed up, and I figured, hey, why not fake it until you make it? I'm using these right angle clamps to kind of help me support the joint, but I'll be honest, they didn't work too well. However, I still managed to get everything nice and square. I decided to go with walnut for the dowels, and I cut them out on the bandsaw. Now, a little tip is when you're doing dowels like this, it's best to kind of round over the edges with some sandpaper, so when you're putting them in, they'll go in a little bit easier. For the 2 smaller trays, I just repeated the exact same steps as I did for the larger trays. Once the glue was dry on all of the dowels, I just cut them off with a flush trim saw and then sanded them all the way down. Then I routed out a 1/4 inch rabbet on the bottom of each tray to attach a bottom panel. And this leaves a rounded corner that I would later have to go back and use a chisel to square up. The next thing that I did was cut out the panels for the bottoms of each tray on the table saw. And after a few adjustments, I was able to get a good fit. Now for the glue up, I'm actually gluing these panels in, and I'm using hide glue again. And then some blue tape just to kind of hold them in place until I could clamp it down. After the glue dried, I sanded all the trays down, which I'm not going to show you because it took forever. And I'm going to finish them using some water-based polyurethane, because I don't want to have the trays yellow over time, which is what oil-based finish would likely do to the maple look. So to keep it nice and pristine, I decided to go with water-based finish. Then I sanded between each coat, and I think I put a total of 3 coats of polyurethane on these trays. Then after the polyurethane was dry, I also used some clear paste wax to coat the trays as well for an extra layer of protection, and this gives them a really nice feel when you're handling the trays. This also gave them a nice sheen, which I tried to pick up on camera, but you have to be there in person to see how really good this looks. The next thing that I did was felt the bottom of the tray, so it added a nice look and protection for the game pieces that would go inside of them. Now for the 2 smaller trays, I'm using 2 pieces of felt that already had adhesive on the back, and I pretty much just cut them down to the size and peeled off the backing and carefully placed them inside. I'm using a razor knife to cut these felt pieces down to size, and you want to make sure that you're using a very sharp razor knife because you don't want it to pull the felt and distort the shape. For the 2 larger trays, I'm using felt pieces that don't have self-adhesive backing, and to glue them down, I'm using hide glue again because of the longer open time, and this will hold just fine to the felt, but you want to make sure that you spread it out evenly over the entire bottom panel. And then I'm just using a glue spreader to even out everything, kind of like using a credit card on a sticker. This really helped get all of the felt down to the panel and helped around the edges as well. And the result was awesome. Now, putting the hardware on the box made me very nervous, so I did put it off as long as I could, but I was getting towards the end of the build, so I figured, hey, it was time to put on the hardware. I'm using these flush hinges on the back of the box, And I screwed in all the screws by hand as to not crack the wood or anything like that. I also used paste wax on the end of each screw to help it go in a little bit easier. I'm using blue tape here to keep the lid in place when drilling the pilot holes for the top of the hinges, so it didn't move on me. Then I marked out where I was going to install the hasp on the front of the box. And as with the hinges on the back, I pre-drilled some holes and used paste wax and hand screwed in all the screws in the front. Then the last thing to do was attach the handles on the side of the box. And I just repeated the same steps as I did with the other hardware. The next thing I did was create some leather pull tabs for the two lower trays, so you would be able to actually pull them out of the box with a little bit more ease. I originally thought about drilling some finger holes in the side of each of the trays on the bottom, but I thought that the leather pull tabs would look a little bit nicer and add some more character to the box itself. And I'm going to attach them using these fancy nails. I'm not sure exactly what the name of them are, but I thought they looked really nice as an accent piece to the leather. And to hammer them in square, I'm using a test piece that I had for the trays, and this did a pretty good job to get those nails in. Now here was the moment of truth where I got to test fit in all the trays, and also make sure that I could pull them out as well. And I was really happy with the fit. I also took into account expansion and contraction, and when I built this box, it was actually extremely hot and humid where I live, and I made sure that the size of the trays took that into account. Now, for the top tray where there were going to be some loose game pieces, I needed to make a divider. So I used some scrap 1/4 inch birch that I had and cut some notches out on the bandsaw so I could make them fit into a cross piece. And then I used some leftover felt to felt them and place the dividers inside that tray. And this worked out very well. The last thing I needed to do for the box was figure out a way to store the manual and a prop telegram that went with the custom pieces of the game. I decided to use the leather that I had made the poles out of and those same nails and use those to go across the lid and make sure that they were somewhat taut enough to hold those documents. I did a lot of research on figuring out how to hold the documents, and I have to say that I was overthinking how I was originally going to do this, and this idea was the simplest idea I came up with, and I think it works the best. And then it was on to laying all the game pieces in the trays and seeing how they fit. And I have to say that everything fit perfectly, and I'm really, really proud of this project. There were a lot of things on this project that I'd never done before, and while it took some time to kind of figure out, I think it turned out pretty good. While this is a game box for a customized game of Catan, this box could actually be used to store anything that you could fit into the trays and into the box, and I designed it that way in case my buddy wanted to use this box for something else further down the road. I hope you got something out of this video and it was somewhat informative or entertaining, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.